Awesome. Thank you everyone for joining us today. I'm Christopher Aaron-Yong, Business Development Manager at Unisearch Expert Opinion Services, and I appreciate you all making the time. Today's live webinar is a joint collaboration between Barry Nilsson Lawyers and Unisearch, of which I am delighted to be your host and moderator. Now, before we begin, I'd like to first acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands on which we all meet today. Rowena and I dial in from the lands of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and Scott from the lands of the Wurundjeri Woi-wurrung and Bunurong peoples of the Kulin Nation. We'd all like to pay our respects to elders past, present and emerging, and any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people joining us today. Now, before we get underway, just a few housekeeping points. As you would have all seen, your cameras and microphones have been disabled for recording purposes, and today's session is being recorded. I'll be facilitating the Q&A at the end, so please feel free to use the chat function to start your questions, and I'll coordinate them towards the end. And if we run out of any time, we'll follow up on any questions directly. If you'd like a certificate of attendance, please make sure you're signed in individually with your full name, and you'll have to remain online for about 45 minutes, or at least 45 minutes. You can then contact Margie from the Barry Nilsson's events team after the session, and they'll arrange a certificate for you. And finally, at the end of this session, we'll be sharing a short survey link, and we would really appreciate you taking the time to provide your feedback because it does help us make sure that these sessions remain relevant and useful to you all. Now, we're in for a really exciting and informative discussion on CTE today. But before I get into the framework of how today is going to work, I wanted to introduce you to our two esteemed panelists. So first, we're joined by Scott Shelley. Scott is a principal in BN's Insurance and Health team, and he's based out in Melbourne. He works closely with insurers, health practitioners, and providers to advise on complex medical negligence, coverage matters, and also has really strong advocacy experience, having appeared in courts, tribunals, and coronial inquests. And second, we have Associate Professor Rowena Mobbs. Rowena is a cognitive neurologist and director at Harbour Neurology in North Sydney, and she's a visiting medical officer at Mater Hospital, Sydney. She's recognised as one of Australia's leading experts in concussion, dementia and CTE, with deep experience in traumatic brain injury and neurodegenerative conditions. And she plays a key role in advancing understanding of brain injury across sporting and non-sporting contexts. And a little about myself, I'm Christopher Yong, former technology lawyer and in-house counsel who graduated with first-class honours. I'm focused on connecting the profession with world-class independent experts such as Rowena to support highly complex litigation where trusted, high-quality advice and expert evidence is critical. Now, just to set the context, in today's timely and important discussion on CTE, we're going to cover three key areas. So first, we're going to set the scene with the current state of play. Second, we'll do a bit of a high level, but dive into causation and diagnostic challenges. And then finally, we'll put our futurist hat on and think about what's coming next. And then we'll close with a concise Q&A, which covers some of the key concepts and questions each of you have shared ahead of time and are eager to get to the bottom of. So with that, we're going to dive right into it. So to set the scene, can I please ask you, starting with Rowena first, from your perspective, where are we right now when it comes to CTE, both medically and perhaps legally?
Thank you, Chris, and it's an absolute pleasure to be with you all today. I'll set the scene now, but I'm going to take a little step back in history. So nearly 100 years ago, CTE, or chronic traumatic encephalopathy, it's a hard C, not encephalopathy, in Australia at least. That was first discovered by Harrison Martland, who's a neuropathologist from around 1928. And that was discovered in boxers first, and there were neurologists that described it further in the 1950s as dementia pugilistica, might be a term that people are familiar with. And for a long time, we thought this condition, which is a type of dementia triggered by repetitive head injuries, was just in boxers. There was a build-up of research into soccer players, interestingly. We've got the World Cup at current. In the 1970s, some really good work in New Zealand looking at axonal injury. So they're the axons connecting with the neurons as having hemorrhages and damage in soccer players with heading. Then another landmark was around 93, 94. There were guidelines released by the NHMRC, so that's the main research body, federally funded in Australia, around football injuries of the head and neck. I declare that was chaired by my father, Ray Newcomb, who was a neurosurgeon. And there was strong involvement actually of all of the codes to this document, looking at head injury as a whole, looking at neck injuries, trying to depower the scrums and avoid cervical fractures, but also some inkling that maybe repeated concussions might not be good for you. That was the sort of scene then. And it wasn't until 2005 in the US, Bennett Omalu, another neuropathologist, discovered the first case of CTE in an NFL player who had played at the highest level over 200 games. And from there was a study of around 99 NFL players with a high rate of CTE in that biased subgroup in the 2000s. And the work has expanded from there towards, I guess I'll broach over into the legally on our timeline now. So around 2013, I think there was the NFL class action, which was a figure of $765 million US, of which I'm not all over this, but I think that it might have been nearly used up at current in terms of that funding. And then in Australia, we saw, I think around 2015, again, a second push from the 1990s, a second push to relook at concussion, singular concussion, as perhaps this has ongoing effects or long-lasting symptoms and potential for brain damage ramifications in football. So rugby league, union, soccer still there, and the AFL. And guidelines were taken more seriously, trying to avoid high hits. We've seen those rules and regulations strengthen over the last decade or so. And in 2018, a landmark in Australia was the Australian Sports Brain Bank was launched by Professor Michael Buckland. My involvement came in at that time because I was floating around Camperdown. I was doing my fellowship. Actually, I was beyond that, I was a consultant neurologist, but I was around the University of Sydney and I heard it on the radio and I thought I might attend this launch because I'm very interested in head injury and sport and dementia. And I offered to be a volunteer neurologist to help players who might be in trouble because I could see that there would be interest and need. And I'm a full-time clinician working in my clinic here, and since then I've seen players coming through and over 200 who might have CTE. So that's the scene in CTE. In terms of all dementia, I just want to lay a little background too, because 100 years ago, again, Alzheimer's disease was discovered, studied. We've known about the proteins that cause it, but it's not been until the last 5 years or so till we've actually got medication that can now target those bad proteins in Alzheimer's and slow the condition down. So the very first disease modification. And when I finished my medical training, I thought, no way in my career would I see disease modification for dementia, but we're at that new age now, and I offer it in my clinic. So it's wonderful to slow that dementia down. We're now looking really, much more vehemently for subtypes of dementia, including Alzheimer's, to pick it up early and treat it. And so the scene is that not only myself, but other neurologists, geriatricians, psychiatrists, and now the GPs are well aware of subtypes of dementia and looking for them. So the future of CTE will be identifying what is the bad tau protein or set of proteins that might cause it, targeting it for the research for disease modification, and maybe one day early cure in terms of prevention as those proteins just start to build up in midlife, 20 years before you get your symptoms. So that's a rough scene there, Chris.
Thanks, Rowena, and really exciting. And just for the audience, in stage 2 of this presentation, we will talk briefly about those biomarkers, those proteins, and also that impact from a legal and claims perspective. So we'll hold on that for now. But Scott, just looking at the kind of lay of the land from a legal perspective, what are you seeing at the highest level?
Yeah, thanks, Chris. Hello, everyone. Stoked to be here talking to you about this topic. Legally, It's an interesting question. We're obviously not at the starting line. That's answering the negative. As Rowena pointed out, this has been in boxes for 100 years. The evidence developed. We've had the cases in the US, UK. We've had some in Australia as well. But one observation is there's not a lot of case law out there sort of tailored directly into CTE. The framework. Now, we don't necessarily need a new framework to deal with these claims because it works in with the existing framework, but guidance on some specific issues that are relevant to this area does have potential to change the landscape. And if you look at where we sit right now, in Australia, we've got the Rook case in Victoria going through, listed for the 12-week trial. We've got the World Rugby case in the UK that seems to be progressing as well. Two very significant cases that have potential to change where we are right now. And in that context, is obviously we've also got, there's increasing knowledge in the community, so more people know about this stuff than they used to. And then we've got the combination of Rowena and her colleagues developing medicines much further advanced than historically it was. So we may be, that combination, seeing more claims coming through. We've got the court cases rolling along where some of the defences that we see in this space might start being tested, the assumption of risks, the exclusion and waivers, dangerous recreational activity, causation. How do we tackle that? There's a statute of limitation argument all through this as well. And as we go along in these cases, the medical evidence is still developing here and now. We'll be looking at the past in some of these matters, but the diagnostic medicine obviously impacts a lot of how these cases can be run. In the causation arguments might not be available as they currently are, or the way they currently are, if things progress on the medicine side further. So it's because at the moment the symptoms can be quite vague, and then working out what's caused by what, all those type of things. As the medicine develops, then the legal position sort of riffs off that to agree, as there's a lot of combination of factors that, some could say, well, are we on the precipice of, significant uptick of claims? Potentially sitting there. There's a lot going that way for it. Or to be less alarmist, we're certainly seen to be sitting in a space where the courts might provide greater guidance on how to tackle these claims than historically we've had with them coming through. And then you're feeding that into some of the insurers that are then might reading the play potentially with the insurer that's come out of the total and permanent disability insurance for the AFL players, footy players. Others are doing the same. Are they reading where this is going? Question mark. Certainly big risk there. So that's sort of the broad state of play, Chris, from a legal perspective.
No, that's perfect. And it definitely seems like we're both at an inflection point for the medical and the legal spheres and professions. So before we move on to the second section on causation and diagnostic challenges, I think it's a bit of a pick your own adventure for this next question. I'll leave it to you both to decide. Did you want to address some of the major misconceptions that individuals are thinking about right now? Or did you want to talk briefly about some clear trends that are emerging? I think both are quite relevant because we're at this inflection point. So I'll leave it to you first, Rowena, to decide which you'd like to comment on.
This is exciting. I'll pick option A, the major misconceptions and myths. The number one that comes to mind is that concussion causes CTE. I hear this time and again. People are worried about the number of concussions they've had, rightly so. A single concussion can ruin your life in terms of ongoing symptoms, some of which might be migraine, by the way, which can fog and fatigue and cause light, sound sensitive and ringing in your ears. It's not just headache. That's very treatable by neurologists. So I always thought wheat from chaff. But the misconception is that CTE is actually due to the repetitive traumatic brain injury exposure. Now, your brain will not always declare a symptom if it's damaged. That's the upshot. So you've got microscopic injuries with tackle after tackle, or fall from a horse after fall from a horse in a jockey race, horse race, or occupational. So I've got military blast exposure patients. Australia has an expertise in military, in sort of breaching doorways. So I've got people who've got 30 years of training others for blasts and breaching, or parachuting as well, and repetitive injury exposure. So the proxy for your risk of CTE is actually the time that you have been exposed, the number of years, not if you've had 50 or 100 concussions. That's actually rather irrelevant, sort of. It's still relevant, it's still a head injury adding up. But really, we're more interested in the thousands, if not tens of thousands, of microscopic brain injuries during your exposure. Now, most of my patients are up at 20 or 30 years or more exposure in their circumstance. So it's your dedicated country footballer who's played till 45 in the bush. It's your military, as I said. I am worried about some women with domestic violence exposure or developmental issues of repetitive head banging behaviour. This can cause CTE, or occupations like mining, for example, are risk. So, and now most of the data is in sports-related CTE, NFL being the main one, but it has been demonstrated across the football codes. So we do have CTE in Australia. Now the question is how much? And this is where I'm passionate about the clinical research in life, because we need to match properly the exposure people have had. What age did you take up your footy? What age did you retire? Did you have any seasons off? Did you play 2 games on a weekend with club and school? Did you play 2 contact sports and have a period? And often they have boxed, they have done rodeo, they've done 2 football codes, whatever it might be. So it's not a blame necessarily on a single cause, of the head injury. It's a collective exposure over a lifetime. So that's the key myth. And I would say that if you've been exposed about 11 years or more, that's really where your risk of CTE starts to climb. For every extra year you're exposed, it's a 30% higher relative risk.
Yikes.
I don't want to be...
the data point is, pretty startling. I think, Scott, I do have a question on that, because we're going to shift briefly to causation and diagnostic challenges. But I think Rowena set the scene really beautifully when she talked about all the different areas that this area might touch in upon. So when we're looking to causation, Scott, how difficult is it to link back someone's systems to a particular exposure or event, especially when you're looking at a litigious matter where there might be multiple contributing factors? I think what we talked about previously was sports, workplace, and other factors such as, a road traffic accident.
Yeah, I'm still a bit tied up on what Rowena just covered there.
Of course.
Look, at the risk of making a general statement on something that's quite factually specific, generally it's really quite difficult in this area. There's, as Rowan's covered, the certain diagnosis can't happen until they're dead. Then we're looking at evidence on head knocks. Where are they? How long have they occurred for? How many? Over what period? That process in itself can be really quite difficult in those, the elite sports, something different where it's recorded, the amateur footy player and things like that, when we're looking at sports clubs, or, the ADF personnel with the recent today's article in the Herald Sun about our military personnel being exposed to those blast injuries, and from 15 years ago, as a report. I'm sidetracked, but looking at that type of thing about getting the evidence up, that's very difficult when you're looking at matters from a long time ago that might not be contemporaneously recorded. You might then be looking at, well, is there permanent damage here as well? Like, that can be difficult to a degree, looking at back over that, working out what symptoms are caused by what. You might have someone that's not a good, reliable historian that is making the claim, and looking at what's the evidence there to back that up. So all of that can lead to disputes over what's caused by what. Was it related to the footy career, whatever it is, the firing a weapon in the military? And if you try and look at, well, the symptom cluster can look like other things, like memory memory and thinking difficulties, mood and emotional changes, behavioural changes, the sleep stuff, all those type of things can, that can look like a psychological condition. That's quite difficult to disentangle all of that, which is why we need people like Rowena to sort of work all that out with other specialties as well, to then try and get to the bottom of that causation piece, which is really tricky.
That's right. And I think one of the key points you touched on there was that intersectionality between it all. And previously, I think we all talked about, Rowena, you talked about how migraines might kind of mask themselves as CTE or vice versa. So I think we might, and I'll let you correct that because I don't think I got that spot on, but I think one of the key things that we need to talk about now is just around the current limitations in diagnosis. So we talked previously around biomarkers and some of the issues around that. Could you just talk through the current limitations in CTE and how they shape clinical decision making currently?
Certainly. So flying back to Alzheimer's, it was only 15 years ago that the literature suggested that a neurologist is your best test of Alzheimer's at above 90% sensitivity and specificity, so that sort of accuracy. But now we've got those biomarkers, so I can run an amyloid PET scan at 99% sensitivity and specificity for Alzheimer's. So currently we're in that sort of past phase with CTE where in my opinion, an expert opinion is the best that we have, and that's integrating a lot of ruling in and ruling out information. So our job daily is to hunt for all those subtypes of dementia I mentioned, and we're really good at, and it's easy to rule out Alzheimer's. A tricky thing on that is that repetitive head injury is a risk for Alzheimer's. It's a risk for Parkinson's, Lewy body disease, motor neuron disease has been very topical of late with dry arrow, of course. Question. So we're in our daily jobs, we've got lots of tools. We've got MRI brain with volume studies, so looking for shrinkage. We've got FDG PET scans looking at metabolic activity, and if low activity indicates dementia. We've got those other specialist PET scans. We use neuropsychology a lot, so that's mapping out the brain cognitively, particularly useful if you have a previous intellectual baseline of someone and you can see a relative decline. There must be a decline pattern for a dementia picture firstly. So when my community members or colleagues come back and say, isn't it just alcohol, isn't it just depression? Usually, a decline pattern in a depressed but also anxious but also highly angry patient, could actually be more dementia side. So we have objective markers of dementia. We have objective ways to exclude mimics. So migraine is one of them, Chris. About 30% of my patients who I think have probable CTE have migraine overlaps. So we treat that away. Alcohol is a common confounding factor. Maybe about 40% of us have at least a binge alcohol history. But really, to get a dementia from alcohol, you're looking at 15 or 20 years of solid nightly drinking, that sort of thing. And so it's just putting the picture together, treating away what you can, monitoring them over time. I've now got this, years of experience of seeing the decline objectively, worsening neuropsychology, worsening imaging in my patients. And now I have them amyloid scan negative. So I know it's not Alzheimer's in a cohort and it indicates CTE. So in my opinion, although the gold standard, of course, is neuropathology, if they're dying with CTE, as Connectors Australia, the support body, would say, they're living with CTE symptoms, And there was a lovely body of work from the US, Boston are the lead researchers in CTE this year, showing that the clinical features and the brain changes map out like what you would expect in any dementia, but particularly can be quite similar to Alzheimer's. So they were just replicating the Alzheimer's research and saying, here it is for CTE. This looks and acts like a dementia objectively. So there's building evidence. There's the Bradford Hill criteria fulfilled as far as causality, and I guess we'll talk on that more. So I feel comfortable in my clinic, as I always have with my boxers, saying, I think you've got dementia pugilistica or CTE, and they get it in their 30s or 40s, really young with more severe. But now in the football scene or other scenes, I think it's reasonable to say you've got probable CTE as a working diagnosis going forward.
Perfect. Thank you, Rowena. And I think that what we're dealing with is a lot of uncertainty in practice. And I think one of the key things that I wanted to talk through briefly before we go on to looking to the future is, Scott, from a claims and litigation perspective, how are insurers, in-house and private legal teams dealing with this uncertainty in their practices?
Yeah, it's a difficult one, and looking at this from a high level, the points that Rowena have made about what we're looking for, and building on what I covered before in response to that causation piece, is there is a evidential issue that bubbles along here about getting a forensic approach to what time period are we looking at, how the claim has been framed, what during that period. Rowena again took us through how the medicine has evolved over that time, and for our cases we're sort of looking at a point in time. So what is the knowledge of the medicine at that point in time, then looking at if we're if it's an organisation we're scrutinising, to speak generally, what knowledge did that organisation itself have about the level of risk during that period, and then in what, if anything, have they done during that period, based on what we know about the medicine at that point, what their knowledge was, what have they implemented through that period. And we could be talking about decades, if not longer ago, about when we're sort of looking at what was happening at the time. It's really tricky to get that evidence in line. So I think that level of uncertainty is being addressed with the investigation side, which is fundamental to then setting the platform for how they're responding to that. And that's, extensive document searches, looking for what witnesses do we have out there. Do we need to fire some witnesses out? Do we need people like Rowena to talk to us about what the medicine is doing at that point in time? Those type of things to then look at assessing where we sit in the defending the claim.
Thanks, Scott. So as we reached around the halfway mark of this discussion, I think we're starting to now think about the future, but also operational and risk management controls, as Scott touched upon. Just briefly, Rowena, from a clinical perspective, what does the best practice risk management or operational controls and procedures look like?
I'll give it my best guess here. I'm never on the sideline, unfortunately. I'm the one who sees them years down the track. But look, it's really about reducing that repetitive head injury exposure. So we've seen so much around singular concussion. I'd like to see those arguments equated by the repetitive head injury exposure discussion here by the lead sports. That's what I'd like to see. So, and there have been efforts. I mean, we've seen the NRL this year bring out some guidelines around the number of minutes exposure during the week in training, and 2/3 of head injury occur during training. And if we halved that exposure, we'd probably halve CTE. But there's wide variation. So I think rugby union might have potentially much stricter guidelines on that. Could the sports talk together and sort of work together to help each other work out that guideline? The key question for the sports is what training do you need to develop the skills sufficient to play your sport at that high level, but minimize your head injury risk? So I get it that you've got to practice tackling, but at what age is that? When can you start tackling? Some people tell me it's 13 or 15, others say 7. And I'm never the expert on tackling. So there's a round table needed here. I think tracking and monitoring. And that's for community members too. I'd love to see the federal government unify this approach. There are lots of private efforts for apps that might give you a concussion, like sort of passport or history or tracking. Maybe a unified approach that's widespread wouldn't be too hard necessarily and easily funded. Encouraging people obviously to come forward with their symptoms of concussion and to take the appropriate time off. We've seen the AIS Youth and Community Guidelines lead a couple of years ago now in terms of that minimum 21 days off with 14-day symptom-free approach of recovery after concussion. Again, I'd like to potentially see that looked to extend for the professional levels to allow their brain to recover. knowing that having a doctor on the sidelines doesn't necessarily change the amount of microscopic head injury you've had. You know, a conservative approach, a precautionary approach is important, in my opinion. And whether you've got top physios helping you recover, I don't think that's going to help your brain necessarily heal faster. So I would see consistency as being important in guidelines across the country.
Thank you, Rowena. And I think those are really good points to kick off the last part of this discussion, which is talking about the future and looking ahead to, you know, aspirations and emerging patterns and trends. And again, following this, we'll go into Q&A. Sharon, I note your question and we'll get around to that shortly. But first, beginning with you, Scott, what are the kind of key developments over the next few years that you anticipate that might help manage this risk?
Yeah, if you look at what is the tension point, it's from legally speaking, who, if anyone's responsible for compensating the risks. Now, there's a policy level to look at that, which is some of the suggestions that Rowena's had, and a claims level to look at it. If you look at the broader, what is happening to look at limiting the consequences of these type of injuries, Rowena's covered those on the sporting sector. You've also seen the health sector intervene with a whole heap of stuff. You've got the specialist concussion clinics, which probably is a better place to talk to. You've got CTE treatment guidelines. You've got the support networks with Dementia Australia and the connectors that Rowena mentioned. You've got the federal government funding into Dementia Australia tailored to CTE. You've got the sporting organisations that have done a whole heap of stuff. Some could say they should be doing more. We've then seen those NFL cases come through, and the claims that the cases that are in Australia here in the UK. We've had a Senate committee review on concussion-related head knocks. There's a whole heap of recommendations in there, including considering putting this type of thing into workers' comp, no fault type of schemes. If you're looking at where are we going with all of this, then spoke of earlier about are we looking at more claims coming? Are we looking at well, we've already seen insurers back out of this area. Are we going to see sharpening up or potentially changes to how they're underwriting risk where there's exposure here? With the courts are heading on where we might get some more definitive guidance here. And then you've got on top of that, probably greater onus on organisations in the private sector taking more steps to address this risk. And I mentioned there was an article today, and that's interesting. We still haven't, last I saw, we hadn't heard from the ADF commented on that about what they did 15 years ago and how they're going to train soldiers with firing weapons if there's a risk of blast injuries from that. So, yeah, that's sort of a waffly answer for you, Chris, but broadly, sort of that's a crystal ball looking forward.
It's always helpful. And I know that discussions around sovereign capability are at the tip of our tongues. So it's always important to kind of think about the defence personnel and like the blast considerations. And turning to you now, Rowena, what are you excited about, or what developments are you thinking about?
Well, as Scott mentioned, the federal government injection of funding was very welcome. So we get to see research funding, but the other 2/3 of the pie is we've seen $1 million roughly for support groups. So for nearly 5 years, we've run a Circle CTE, National CTE Support Program, now expanding around the country for people with probable CTE. And that's really starting the ball rolling for just the health sector to care for these people. So no matter what the cause or causes, just being there as neurologists, neuropsychologists, it's expert-led and facilitated group care, which is actually an affordable model for the health system. But of course, we'd probably like to see rolled out clinics within the public health system, as well as now the private sector is getting into gear and considering the diagnosis now. So that was very welcome. We've seen the $11 million that will come through next year as far as the slip, slop, slap campaign around repetitive head injury. So that's been one of my long-standing dreams and career goals. It's really exciting to see that start to come in. And yeah, I think we've got a way to go in terms of training practitioners to look for the key features. I'll touch on the signature symptoms we look for in this long 20 or 30-year decline in dementia pattern. So early on in the youth, you might, and from earliest age 17 is the neuropathology worldwide, 17, but symptoms come in later from the build-up in the brain of bad proteins, tau protein. The symptoms early might be neuropsychiatric in flavour. So a rise in anxiety, a rise in depression, there's debate about suicidal ideation and suicide, but you get this characteristic anger and dysregulation emotionally. So at the drop of a hat, a minimal trigger, and the family will tell you they're walking on eggshells not to trigger the anger. That's frequent daily, and that gets worse. You then get memory decline, you get language deficits worsening, and then global cognitive worsening, as in any dementia. As the brain shrinks, it becomes lighter and it loses its function. And in terms of costs and things, I mean, you're looking at a potentially long nursing home care situation here, you know, so the family is struggling, the carers have huge comorbidities, there may be young children in this young onset dementia in the 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s. You're looking at then the residential care aspect. So, and it's much longer path, I think, than Alzheimer's, which is 6 to 10 years on average from the onset of symptoms to demise. So yeah, I think, and then on the military, or Chris, I wanted to touch on, there's probably an ethical debate here. Do you train up more people to be potentially exposed to a lesser amount, or do you pick a few, you know, men and women who are going to serve the country and be exposed to longer and more severe repetitive blast injury? We have to have service personnel. It's a very hard ethical debate in my mind.
Multifaceted and pretty challenging.
Yeah.
Before we get into the Q&A shortly, I think the audience is really keen to understand either one key takeaway or something they need to prioritize. So I'll leave it to you both to decide how you want to approach this question. But if the audience had to think about one key risk, one practical takeaway, or potentially something they need to prioritize today, what would you suggest it be?
Rowena, mine's boring, so I might go first in case you've got something more exciting, or otherwise I'll set the scene because you probably won't be this boring. For assessing the level of exposure to these claims, priority number one, and priority number two, then working out what can be done to protect people from this risk, because that then flows into protecting them from their own liability. I know it's not exciting, but if that's the one takeaway, Gerard, you've probably got something more exciting than I do.
Mine's very boring too, Scott, I'm afraid. So I come back, I'm a conservative practitioner, even though I'm out there, and I just come back to principles of medicine, which is first listen to your history. So think about the potential for CTE or repetitive head injuries adding up, and just ask those historical questions, as you guys tend to do, very detailed and beautiful sort of histories. And then I guess in terms of medically, I would say to my colleagues, you know, we're always selective in terms of our investigations. I've seen a few strange things in this area, which I think because of the media buzz and the commercial interest potentially, there's stuff around, you know, well, devices is one that may or may not come through. We shouldn't assume it will be helpful, like headgear or mouth guards might be. But then things like magnetoencephalogram scans, MEG scans, even TMS, that's very broad, that's sort of used for depression in psychiatry. It's not really a dementia type treatment or test. So we've seen a few, I would say, borderlands involvement of research investigations in this space. So my message generally would be consider just stock standard neurology or geriatrician or stock standard medical pathways in this space.
That's brilliant, and thank you both. Sometimes simple is best.
Yeah.
So now I'd like to turn briefly to the Q&A. I know we've got some questions in the chat, and I know a lot of the audience have sent through questions ahead of time when you've registered. So thank you to each and every one of you for doing that. What the BN and Unisearch teams have done is distill those key concepts into some really actionable questions for both Scott and Rowena. But I might first start with Sharon's question. Hi, Rowena, could you please explain why in living patients we are referring to these systems as likely CTE and not traumatic encephalopathy syndrome?
Yeah, I do divide them at the moment. It's a great question, and clearly you're well read. This is the traumatic encephalopathy syndrome is at current the research term for we think you might have CTE during life. So symptoms that would seem to be CTE. It's still under research criteria, and the 2021 CATS criteria are very rudimentary. It's like, do they have a dementia that's impairing them? Have you ruled out other things? Do they have some sort of supportive feature like a bit of Parkinsonism? And they have the high repetitive head injury exposure. You know, I like to say it's not neurosurgery. It's pretty straightforward, neurology. But yeah, I think we will build on that as the research comes through. Really what we're going to need is probably a PET scan targeted to a tau biomarker to really kick things along for diagnostic algorithms in this space. So at current, that's why I don't use the research tests term, because people will think I'm reliant on that. I use probable CTE because I'm reliant on my expertise and integrating all the information together.
Great. Thank you, Rowena. And now, Scott, from a financial liability perspective, who do you think will step forward to pay in future cases? That's from Renato.
Yeah, that is the question. And that is what everyone is dancing around. If you look at what the NFL settlement, I think that's north of $1 billion somewhere on last count on them funding this. And if you look at our local codes, don't expect they've got $1 billion in the bank to be able to fund this type of thing. And if you're looking at to the private market, to the insurers, then why are they going to? They're on the business of writing certain risks. So I think they're not going to be coming at this either, which is why you come back to the Senate committee sort of talking about incorporating into no fault statutory scheme as well here, which that's got its own a series of problems in itself in asking the taxpayer potentially to fund a claim for CTE for playing in the amateur leagues, playing a leisure pastime, essentially a leisure pastime for an injury that's causing leisure pastime. So there's a whole heap of issues with that themselves. And then if you look at it at the moment, well, Medicare is funding some of this anyway. So some of this is getting pushed onto Medicare as it is. So it's a good question. I don't have the answer, but someone will look at that, because that's where a lot of the questions have been driven. The government's been looking at it, and all the private organisations and our insurers have been considering it as well. And I think there will be an attention point if you look at Insurers Council of Australia's latest submissions on changing the civil liability settings around the country as well, because of claims cost that sort of feeds into this as another problem for them. Not an answer, Chris.
No, it's always helpful, even if only for the insights, because you're closer to the ground, and the report that your team authored does cover the Rook class action, the developments overseas in different codes. So it just provides the audience with an opportunity of, these are the breadcrumbs that we might follow that might provide those answers around that financial liability. Just quickly, Rowena, from a clinical perspective, how does repeated head trauma affect the brain's ability to recover after an initial injury?
Well, you've got the symptom level firstly. So I guess people do know in themselves they feel a bit slower. There's some excess sleep often that might then turn into insomnia. There's the fog, fatigue, inability to concentrate, attend, headaches, neck aches, nausea, vomiting. So they can all go on actually for years. And as I've mentioned already, migraine can sort of sit on the brain, and it's migraine until proven otherwise in my book. But then you do have injuries directly to nerves at the back of the head. And then you've got, the brain injury itself might be doing something. There are some really good studies out of Cambridge where there's changes on their brain imaging, their research imaging a year after one concussion. So that's a worry as far as the hidden issues. In terms of repetitive head injuries, well, you're likely to have chronic inflammation going on and oxidative stress and inflammatory factors floating around. And at some stage, and we don't know why or when or how, there is a triggering off of the actual neurodegenerative dementia process. So that's when you're getting the death of neurons, the death of support cells. We know some sort of interaction between the blood vessels, the blood-brain barrier is suspected as some involvement here, and the astrocyte support cells around them for CTE. So this is the gold standard question. Is there a buildup of tau protein at some point? And it builds up in the valleys of the brain. So the folds. At the base of those folds, we think they're mechanically susceptible. And then it spreads south to the traditional areas for Alzheimer's. So it's sort of the opposite pattern of an Alzheimer's dementia. And eventually it spreads throughout someone's brain and into severe stages.
And Rowena, I think that's a really good lead into Laura's question. So do you think we'll be able to reach a point of diagnosis based off symptoms? And are there advances in medical tech that will see us be able to diagnose these while the patient is living?
So presumably for CTE rather than concussion, I guess, where that patient is living. So never would we diagnose on symptoms. It's always the objective information coming in. So it'd have to be unified with the radiological features, the neuropsychology testing, or whatever blood-based biomarkers abound in future. So Alzheimer's does have a blood test newly available in Australia in the last 3 months, which is not as good as your PET scan, but it's still pretty good. So we'll see that start to come in. There's a very wide time gap between your repetitive concussions and then your development of a CTE dementia. There's sort of a 10 or 20 year gap usually, but eventually we'll see the research fields unite, and there'll be, I think, blood-based biomarkers, probably not saliva or sweat. I'd say we're more looking at blood-based, hopefully not repeated lumbar punctures for anybody. And yeah, it'll be interesting to see when that does occur.
Thank you, Rowena. And Scott, taking the discussion back to the present. So for individuals and insurers managing claims involving head injuries today, what approaches can help improve outcomes for clients while also supporting an effective claims process?
That's a hard one, Chris, without knowing the product line we're talking about.
It's okay if the answer is it depends. Like that's
I don't want to sound too loyal like Chris. Look, I think if you're looking at if that's a statutory class or the TPD or income protection type of side of things, then if there's dollars are spent on the person's treatment to progress, help with limiting getting a diagnosis or limiting the effects of that if you've got to treat the condition itself, and then second, completing investigations about all those causation questions that we covered, and if there's a breach of duty question or applying it to statutory classes, probably not, whether the circumstances then trigger whatever requirements we've got to have. So two-pronged approach, if you can, there, Chris. So.
Thank you, Scott. And one more for Rowena before we do one final forward-looking question. Given the complexity of CTE and the number of potential contributing factors, how do you approach distinguishing causation from correlation when attributing long-term neurological outcomes to sporting exposure?
Oh, goodness. I'm not sure well, I guess I take all that cumulative head injury history, but I'm never thinking in a legal sense sort of causation and blaming anything. You know, we're pretty non-judgmental, and we deal with the symptoms as they come, and we just try to help people at the end of the day. So yeah, but in terms of that question specifically, I'd say is best answered in terms of monitoring in the future. So how is the condition evolving? How do you match that in terms of the background history? Remember, we're not just asking about repetitive head injuries. We're talking about, do they have meningitis in childhood, all of their alcohol history, other toxins or exposures, their developmental histories, family histories, comorbidities. Do they have diabetes for 10 years? You know, so a lot of this information becomes complex and integrated. And very often, you know, it's the art of medicine. We don't always know exactly what has caused the other thing. But if I have any suspicion that something else has cropped up as a causative factor, I'll look for it. I'll treat it away where I can. You know, so monitoring always of patients.
Thank you. And would you say, and this is a build off David's final question before I get into the final one, would you say, is it too soon to diagnose a potential CTE at 21 years of age? Is age a restriction on diagnosis?
Yeah, so the youngest patient I have, or patients actually, is mid-30s, in a particular football code, who would appear to be probably genetically susceptible. They've got a clean history otherwise, clean bill of health, no other risk factors. It just seems to have evolved, and they've got very, shrunken, quite striking appearance for dementia on their imaging. So it can be as young as that. I suppose in answer to the other question too, obviously we're just looking at the time proportion. You know, did they play their rugby league for 40 years versus a couple of years boxing? You know, would probably lean to the rugby league. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Well, sorry, just to
No, please.
Sorry to take your role on, guys.
No, mate.
Do you just with the? Do you see gymnasts, children? I saw always children gymnasts with head knocks in the.
I've seen the occasional gymnastic or acrobatic injury, but that's more singular, and it's not, in my book, going to be a risk substantively of CTE. Yeah, and I think 21-year-olds overall can be reassured. I reckon probably the best age might be to consider 25 to think about another avenue in life, just on that long-term risk. But nobody knows. This is where the data gap is, and we need funded research.
Thank you both, Scott and Rowena. So a final question for you both. If we were to have this conversation again in 5 years' time and reconvene as a group, what do you think would have changed most about our understanding of CTE and its implications?
Scott, do you want to kick off?
Yeah, I can. It's broadly, well, I think the medicine is going to progress. Number one, as Rowena's covered, Rowena's covered that on how the medicine is going, and I think that's going to change. And if that changes, then so does the approach on how we're approaching these claims now. The other thing that I mentioned earlier is we might get some decent guidance out of the courts in the short-term horizon, which again will impact the approach. So I think that we could be looking at a whole different game in 5 years' time than what we are now.
Yeah, and I would say we will probably have a biomarker. We'll have a tau nominal target for future therapeutic trials if the pharmaceutical companies start to become interested. And that then will take 5 to 10 years to develop a drug to slow it. And then I also think community awareness will be skyrocketed. I'm not so sure we'll see a drop-off in participation in sport. I think we might just see a shift to considering other sports that might not be head injury laden. So maybe netball will be up there with, the Socceroos or something. I don't know.
And Scott, just quickly, you talked about the dangerous recreational activity and, the CLA, and, when Rowena talked about different codes being considered and different people adopting different sports, do you think there's going to be any particular patterns or trends through the changes in the Civil Liability Act?
I would have thought that changes will be about how those leagues are incorporating the precautions they're taking to address this risk more than the CLE, which I think those changes, and maybe how the people agree to participate in these sports, the warnings and information given to them, the requirements on reporting concussion or head knocks. Is the other thing is you got the amateur leagues where someone might hide they've had it to keep playing, and you don't have a medical professional on the sideline that might be able to pull them up, or you might not have someone paying attention, or that sort of things, rather than sort of looking at that CLE, the civil liability side of things, because that's a pretty difficult road to get changes to that legislation, as you know, and how hard it was to get the sort of the report and all that sort of stuff through. So.
Of course, thank you. And Rowena, a final point. I know that you provide some high-level advice some guidance on identifying CTE for casual sports players, like, people that have kids. It's a very simple framework. For our audience today, do you mind just running through that?
Yeah, so if you're worried about CTE, what do you do and think about it? So I think you're looking for that, you would probably know there's a partial not you, Chris, I mean people with it. So there's a partial insight preservation. So people are generally aware that their mood's different, they're struggling to learn things in their workplace, struggling with work overall, struggling not to react to their kids so strongly, and that walking on eggshells type stuff. So and often social isolation. So if this is on a progressive decline, you might think, gosh, over a 10, 15-year period, is there something going on? My opinion is that all of these sort of high-risk people, be they amateur or professional, could do with a review every 5 years. So that on a public health basis, that might be a GP review running a little test, or if we could afford it or whatever, it might be a neurologist or fellow, equivalent specialist looking at that longer test and an MRI. You can have as many MRIs as you like in a lifetime. There's no radiation. PET scans we have to be selective about. So the ultimate answer is, if you are ever worried in the audience, go and see your GP and consider seeing a specialist. Yeah.
Thank you. And final comments on headgear?
Yeah, not proven yet. So there's a backed by Connectivity Australia TBI, a different organisation to Connectors Australia. So they have funded research with Monash University and a business, a commercial platform to test headgear, I think, in football codes. That research hasn't come through, and my players tell me time and time again, if they wore headgear, they felt more superhuman, and they'd go in harder to the tackle. And ultimately, if you drop an eggshell from 1 metre or 3 metres, it's still a head injury. I'm not sure the headgear is going to really prevent that much, unfortunately.
No, thank you. And thank you again, Scott and Rowena, for your time. I really appreciated your insights. And I think across the board, we were able to cover a lot of different topics at both a high level and quite a lot of depth when it came to the clinical perspective. Before we wrap up, could I please get a very warm virtual thank you from everyone to our panelists, Associate Professor Rowena Mobbs and Scott Shelley, Principal at BN. As you would have seen, Margie's popped in a survey link. If you could please take a couple of moments following this session to please fill that out, it would be greatly appreciated. I'm Christopher Yong from Unisearch, and it's been my pleasure to speak alongside Scott and Rowena, and I look forward to seeing you all next time. Thank you.